She was screaming into the empty heat long before anyone heard her. Her voice cracked under the sun as if the desert itself wanted to swallow the sound. Maggie Doyle hung twisted on that wooden frame in the middle of the Lincoln prairie, one leg yanked high by a cruel rope. Her dress torn, her skin scraped raw by dust and splinters. She kept trying to pull her dress down with bound wrist, but every breath only made her shame worse. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the fear that no one would ever see her as anything except a broken body left for the vultures. She whispered for help even when she knew the desert had no mercy. Prescott's men had tied her up and rode away laughing, saying the heat would make her confess before nightfall. But there wasn't anything to confess, only a truth she feared would die with her if no one heard it. A shadow finally moved on the horizon. A rider approached slow and cautious, dust rising behind the hooves. She prayed it wasn't one of Prescott's men returning to finish what they started. When he stopped beside her, she met a pair of tired blue eyes under the brim of a worn cowboy hat. Jacob Hale didn't speak at first. He only stared in shock at the sight of her, suspended in the burning wind. Then his gaze slipped lower without warning. His eyes fell into the place she wanted hidden more than anything on earth. A blaze of shame shot through her like fire. Her voice ripped out of her throat. "Don't look there!" Jacob jerked his head away, guilt burning across his face, but he couldn't unsee what he had seen. He couldn't pretend the marks on her skin were anything except the work of a monster. Now the only question left in her mind was simple and terrifying. Would this man ride away and leave her to die like the others did, or would he do the unthinkable and risk everything to save a woman he was never meant to see? Jacob didn't leave, not after hearing her voice shake like that. Not after seeing the bruises on her legs and the burned mark nobody should ever carry on their skin. He stood there in the boiling wind, trying to steady his breath, trying to decide what kind of man he was going to be today. Instead, Jacob stepped closer. Slow. Careful. Maggie tried to twist away from him, but the ropes held her tight. She squeezed her legs together in pure instinct, whispering again, even softer this time. "Don't look there." Jacob swallowed hard. He lifted both hands a little to show he wasn't a threat. "Ma'am, I ain't here to stare. I'm here because you look like you're dying." His voice was gentle, rough with guilt, and Maggie felt it. Most men were liars when they played the hero, but Jacob didn't move like a liar. He moved like a man who had seen too much and didn't want to add another ghost to his conscience. He circled the wooden frame, checking the knots. His fingers brushed the rope and he cursed under his breath, a soft, unhappy sound because the knots were tied to cut into skin. "Prescott's style, all right," he muttered. Maggie flinched when she heard that name. Jacob leaned in and spoke low. "If he did this to you, he meant to break more than your bones." Maggie closed her eyes. A tear slid over her cheek. Jacob touched her ankle gently and checking circulation, and she jerked again. "Easy. I'm just making sure you can feel your foot." "I can feel all of it," she whispered. "And I wish I couldn't." He looked up at her. Their eyes met for the first time without fear in the way. That single look told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't guilty. She wasn't wicked. She wasn't anything Prescott had said. She was a woman trying to survive a world that liked breaking the softest people first. Jacob took a breath and made a choice. "All right, I'm getting you down." Then came the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats, 2 riders returning fast, Prescott's men. And the question that slammed into Maggie's chest was simple and cold. Would Jacob fight to save her now that danger was right in front of him? Or would he abandon her to save himself? Jacob heard those hoofbeats, and every old instinct in him snapped awake. He didn't have the luxury to think anymore. Thinking got people killed. He stepped in close to Maggie, close enough that she could feel the heat from his chest against her side. "Hold on," he said softly, before she could ask to what. His knife flashed. The rope at her wrist snapped free. Pain rushed back into her arms as blood began to move again. She bit down a cry, more from stubborn pride than strength. Jacob cut the rope on her raised leg and grabbed her around the waist as she sagged. For half a second, her torn dress slipped again, and she hissed, "Don't look there." He didn't. He pulled his own coat loose and wrapped it around her hips with quick, rough hands. 2 horses slid to a stop in a spray of dust. Prescott's men, the first one, a skinny fellow with bad teeth, grinned when he saw Maggie on the ground. Boss said leave her till sundown. What are you doing? Hale. Jacob straightened up, keeping Maggie behind him as best he could. But his voice was steady. I am changing the schedule. The second man spat. He smelled like cheap whiskey, and his eyes had that lazy, drunk shine. Heard you used to wear a uniform. Thought you knew how to follow orders. Jacob smiled without humor. That is why I quit. The skinny one swung down from his saddle, hand on his gun. Step away from the girl. Jacob moved first, but he wasn't fast like a young buck anymore. His fist crashed into the man's jaw with a dull crack, and pain shot up his own arm. The man didn't drop clean. He staggered and swung back wild, knuckles catching Jacob across the nose. Blood started from Jacob's nostril at once. The second went for his revolver. Jacob grabbed his wrist, but his grip wasn't as quick as it used to be. The other man drove a hard elbow into Jacob's ribs, right where an old war scar liked to ache when the weather turned. White pain exploded in his side, and his knees dipped. The gun slipped from the man's hand and hit the dirt near Maggie's feet. On pure panic and something that felt a lot like stubborn pride, she snatched it up with both hands. She had never fired a pistol in her life, but she pointed it at the sky and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the empty field like thunder. Both men froze and flinched, hands flying away from their belts. You want to try that again? She shouted, her voice shaking but loud. Next time I might not miss. They looked from Jacob's bloody face to the woman with wild eyes and a smoking gun, and whatever courage the whiskey had given them leaked right out of their boots. They backed toward their horses, cursing and holding their bruised jaws, then swung up and rode off in a cloud of dust and shame. He wiped the blood from his nose. He spat a dark streak of tobacco juice into the dust. Can you sit a horse? I will fall off, she whispered. I will catch you, he said. He lifted her into the saddle with a grunt that sounded like it came from his boots. Then he swung up behind her, one arm firm around her so she wouldn't slide, the other taking the reins. The horse leaped forward, past the groaning men, toward the distant line of the Capitan Hills. As the prairie wind hit her face, Maggie tried to breathe, but the world kept tilting sideways. Her fingers loosened in the horse's mane, and her head fell back against Jacob's shoulder. Stay with me, he murmured, but her eyes were already rolling shut. The last thing she felt was the steady beat of his heart against her back. And then the world went dark again. If this story made you feel something, go ahead and tap like. And subscribe so you don't miss the next ride. Grab your coffee or tea. Keep listening to these old West Hearts and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where you are listening from, because your story matters too. By the time the Capitan Hills rose up like a row of tired giants in the distance, Maggie wasn't fighting the saddle anymore. She was out cold. Her weight sagged against Jacob's chest, hot with fever. Breath shallow and ragged. An old scar along his ribs from a field called Shiloh throbbed with every breath. But he ignored it the way he ignored most of his own pain. He guided the horse off the main trail, along a narrow deer path that wound between rocks and scrub. They finally stopped in a shallow draw above the Rio Bonito, tucked under a shelf of stone. That night her fever broke loose. She shivered and burned by turns, mumbling half words about brands and numbers and a man's boots on her throat. Jacob soaked a bandana in the cold creek and laid it across her face, her neck, the unmarked parts of her leg, working in slow circles till his own fingers went numb. He propped her up and poured water between her lips a little at a time. Once her hand clawed weakly at his shirt and she whispered another broken, "Don't look there." He swallowed hard. "I'm not," he said. "I'm just keeping you here." By the second sunrise, her breathing had settled, and the wild shine in her eyes had faded to a tired clear. She hated how weak her legs felt, but she also felt the steady strength in him. The way he moved, like carrying her, wasn't a burden at all. He set her down on a blanket and stepped back right away so she could pull his coat tighter around herself. "I'm going to look at that leg," he said quietly. Maggie tensed. "Not there." His eyes met hers. "Not for me. For you." He knelt at her side, keeping his gaze on her face while his hands worked at the torn fabric. Only when she gave a tiny nod did he let his eyes drop, just long enough to see the damage. The skin around the brand was angry and swollen, ringed with ugly purple bruises. There was dried blood where the rope had rubbed her raw. He let out a slow breath through his teeth. "That man should be in chains," Jacob muttered. "That man owns half the cattle in Lincoln," Maggie answered. "And the law has supper at his table." She watched his jaw tighten. "Is that why he did this to you?" "Because you saw too much." Her laugh came out bitter and thin. "I saw his men cutting other brands off hides. I saw extra cattle on the drive, more than any neighbor reported missing. I told him the numbers didn't add up. He said my eyes were the problem." She swallowed. "Next thing I knew, I was tied to that frame. And he made sure the only thing anyone would talk about was my shame, not his theft." Jacob cleaned the wound as gently as he could, using water from his canteen and a strip of clean cloth from his own shirt. Every touch burned, but the care behind it cooled something in her heart. "You didn't have to come back for me," she whispered. "Maybe not," he said. "But I saw what he carved into you. If I ride away from that, I am no better than him." They sat there as the sky turned gold. Two people who had almost been strangers that morning, now bound together by a secret written on her skin. Maggie stared at the fading light and asked the question that had been clawing at her since he cut her down. "Jacob, what are you going to do when Prescott comes looking for you because of me? Run, or ride back into that town and drag his sins into the sunlight for everybody to see?" Jacob didn't answer right away. He just watched the sky bleed from gold to orange as if it were thinking right along with him. "When I was young," he finally said, "I wore a blue coat and did what I was told. I watched men get hurt because I looked the other way. I promised God and myself I wouldn't do that again. But we aren't riding into Lincoln tomorrow," he added. "Not with you barely standing and me breathing like an old mule." Instead, he took her to a small spread in the next valley, a weathered little ranch run by Cal Turner, a former federal soldier who owed Jacob his life from a field back east where the guns never seemed to stop. Cal took one look at Maggie, at the brand on her leg and the bruises all over, and his face went stone cold. By the next evening, there were 4 more men around Cal's kitchen table, all gray at the temples, all carrying old scars and new grudges against cattle barons who thought they owned the whole territory. Cal poured coffee thick enough to float a horseshoe, and nobody said a word till the cups were empty. They were tired men who had seen too many bullies stay rich and walk free. They sent a telegram up to Fort Stanton with Jacob's name on it and Cal's and the names of 2 men who had seen Prescott's crew run stolen cattle through the canyon. Cal's nephew rode to Lincoln to hire a photographer, the kind who could carry his camera on a wool man, and brought him quiet to the ranch. Maggie set her jaw and let them take a picture of the brand and the bruises, proof that could travel farther than her voice ever would. A few days later, Jacob and Maggie rode back into Lincoln with Cal and the other old soldiers not far behind them. Prescott stepped out from his office, red-faced and sure of himself. He said Jacob was a fool, a lawbreaker, a man blinded by a wicked woman. That was when Maggie did the hardest thing she had ever done. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. She stepped out in front of them all, in front of wives and ranch hands and the town preacher, and she said, "You told him not to look at me. You told all of them not to look, because if they ever did, they would see what you are." With Jacob beside her, she showed the mark Prescott had burned into her skin. Proof that the man they feared had never feared ruining a woman to protect his stolen cattle. An officer from Fort Stanton, who had ridden in because of the telegram Cal sent, stepped forward and asked his own questions. By the end of that week, Prescott wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the one being watched, being judged, being led away in irons instead of praise. Later on, Maggie stood on Jacob's porch, looking out over a field that didn't feel cursed anymore. "You know," she said softly, "if you had ridden away that first day, I would have died thinking I wasn't anything but that mark." Jacob shook his head. "You ain't the brand, Maggie. You are the hand that holds the iron now." This isn't a story about bullets or cattle. It is about one question every man has to face sooner or later. When they tell you not to look, do you look away, or do you look straight at the truth and stand your ground? If this story made you feel something, go ahead and tap like. And subscribe so you don't miss the next ride. Grab your coffee or tea. Keep listening to these old West Hearts. And tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where you are listening from, because your story matters too.